The Daredevil TV series originally aired from 2015 to 2018. That time period gave us seasons 1 through 3. Then in 2025, season 4 came out, which actually picked up where season 3 left off. And for those who may not know, the series is based on the Marvel comic book character Daredevil, where, quote, a blind lawyer by day and vigilante by night, Matt Murdock fights the crime of New York as Daredevil, end quote. As we like to do here on the Spun Today podcast, let's give a shout out to the writers. And there are a bunch, especially when you factor in all 4 seasons, as well as the comic book creators of the character. But bear with me, because these writers definitely do deserve their flowers. Let's start off first and foremost with the late, great Stan Lee, who absolutely deserves his own applause break there. Followed by Bill Everett, Drew Goddard, Luke Caltew, Ruth Fletcher, Christos N. Gage, Whit Anderson, Sneha Korse, Dylan Gallagher, Tanya Kong, Sarah Stryker, Douglas Petrie, Marco Ramirez, Stephen S. DeKnight, Lauren Schmidt Hisrich, Eric Olson, Joe Pukowski, John C. Kelly, Mark Burke, Jim Dunn, Sam Ernst, Dara Resnick, Tamara Betcher, Sonae Hoffman, Niwa Nasruddin, Wally Wood, Matt Corman, Chris Ord, we're almost getting there, folks, Dario Scartapane, Catherine Blair, Devin Kleiger, Jill Blankenship, Jesse Wigato, Heather Belson, David Fagey, Drain Godfrey, and last but certainly not least, Thomas Wong. Shout out to each and every one of the writers that put this amazing series together. The main focus of this breakdown has to do with how the writing uses moral ambiguity, emotional backstory, and world building to make the story resonate beyond the comic book genre. So if that interests you, please stick around. Daredevil isn't just another Marvel superhero movie, or show rather. What struck me while watching seasons 1 through 4, especially the first 3, which came out almost a decade ago, is how much it plays like a gritty crime drama first, and a comic book story second. I thought it was really ahead of its time in that regard. The tone of the series is much darker than what you would expect from a comic book superhero series. There's cursing and blood and violence, and it's really a masterclass in writing, creativity, and storytelling. And the very beginning of the series sets the tone. Matt Murdock's character, aka Daredevil, played by Charlie Cox, his origin story is tragic, like a lot of heroes. But in his case, he gets blinded as a kid by these toxic chemicals, and he did so by saving like an old man's life that he saw was going to get hurt by them. And the last thing that he saw before losing his eyesight forever was his father rushing to his side. And that detail alone is such a powerful hook. The idea that the final image burned into his memory is his dad, the man that he'll spend the rest of his life trying to live up to. And then, of course, fast forwarding a bit, his father's sacrifice was an amateur boxer refusing to throw a fight so that his son can see him win cleanly, only for him to get killed by the mob, leaving his son, who was already without a mother, now blind and without a father. So from jump, you realize that Daredevil is about the cost of honor and the sense of morality that the series wrestles with throughout, and how individual trauma shapes us. And what is a good superhero story without a great villain, right? And what makes it even more of a brilliant series is how Matt's backstory mirrors his villain's backstory. Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin, played by the illustrious Vincent D'Onofrio, as a kid killed his own father. He was like this meek little kid, and he had a really abusive father that was always like pushing him and like forcing him to like stand up for himself, to the point that he like would beat him up and then go with him to beat up the bullies that beat up his son. His father, Bill Fisk, played by another great actor, Dominic Lombardozzo, as a young kid just snaps at his father's abuse. This time he was like abusing his mom. And to stand up for his mom, hits his father in the back of the head with a hammer and just doesn't stop until he's non-responsive. And then the mother, half in shock and half relieved because this monster that abused them both for years is now dead. She winds up helping her son cover it up, which imprinted in his mind that he did something good, something positive. He protected his mother. It was validating the action, as violent and gruesome and horrible as it was. And then he carries that trauma forward in his own way. And the show constantly forces you to see them as two sides of the same coin. And that's really good story writing right there. When your hero and your villain basically are mirror images of each other, you don't get just good versus evil, black and white. You get a meditation on choice, on morality. And you get to see how two different people, two different personalities can internalize a very similar trauma, very relatable pains. You get to see what it is that they do with it. By season 2, the storytelling deepens with the introduction of another iconic Marvel character, Frank Castle, aka the Punisher, played by the great Jon Bernthal. And his character is so good that there's a spin-off series of the Punisher, which I also began watching for the first time, with his character, and that takes place within the same world. But the introduction of his character into this series was genius. His character and Matt's character, they want the exact same thing, which is justice. But they couldn't be more different with how they want to get there. Daredevil, although he beats the shit out of the bad guys, he refuses to kill. He has like that Batman-esque type moral code where he can't kill. Plus, by day, he's a lawyer. And his idea of justice, and we see it get more and more jaded as the series progresses, but is to use the law to get justice and put the bad guys behind bars. Whereas on the flip side, the Punisher doesn't hesitate to kill any and every bad guy. He's a kill first, don't even bother asking questions later type of dude. And he has his own code where he's utterly ruthless, but only towards bad guys. But then you fall into that like moral ambiguity of who is it that gets to decide who's bad and who's good. And his character in Daredevil's butt heads throughout season 2 on this very topic. And there's this great scene that takes place at a cemetery where we get a bit of insight into Punisher's mysterious character. And he gives this monologue, which I'll get into in a bit, but where essentially he tells us about losing his family, and it's fucking haunting. And it makes you understand him and why he is the way he is, even if you don't agree with how he goes about getting his version of justice. And that's the type of gray morality that really kept me hooked into the series. And then to mix things up even more, the writers did a phenomenal job with how they actually have Punisher and Fisk work together temporarily out of necessity, because they hate each other. You know, Fisk is like the quintessential bad guy. You know, he's the Kingpin, pulling all the strings with all the evil shit that's going on. So they're definitely at odds, but for a brief moment, their interests align. And that's such a great writing move, to complicate alliances, to muddy the morality, to put the heroes in situations where they have to team up with villains and vice versa. And not necessarily because they want to, but because the story demands it. The situation that was created demands it. That's top tier tension right there. We also have a great character in Foggy Nelson, played by Eldon Henson, which is Matt Murdock's college/law school best friend and now partner. And he's like the physical manifestation of what keeps Matt's faith in the law, in the legal system. He's also one of the first, if not the first, character in the series to learn about Matt's double life, his secret identity as Daredevil. Then by the time we get to season 3, the series starts peeling back layers through backstory. We find out that Fisk is manipulating an FBI agent known as Benjamin Poindexter, aka Dex, played by Wilson Bethel. And the way they visually show Fisk like reading his case files while we see flashbacks into Dex's like troubled childhood and how he was like a sociopath since he was little, a really troubled kid in therapy, but excelled in whenever he was in an environment with a specific rigid framework, like the military, like the FBI, the corporate environment even worked for him for some time. But it's like a double-edged sword, because we find when put into a negative version of that rigid framework, such as organized crime and essentially given the license and cover to kill and do crime, he also excels at that. He was a really interesting character in the series. And you have Karen Page's character, played by Deborah Ann Wall, who becomes a paralegal at first for Matt and Foggy when they open up their fledgling law firm, and then pivots to being like this sidekick / reporter. And we find that her character, in time, we find that she's carrying a shitload of trauma and guilt and regret that we realize shape her choices throughout the series, which is a really good reminder for us as writers that if you want your characters to feel real, give them scars. Like, don't be afraid to darken their past, even if it's not something that's revealed right away or revealed at all. I also enjoyed how the series, specifically where I noticed it more was in season 4, but where it leans into realism with all these like small cultural details that just made this fantastical superhero landscape feel more grounded and realistic. Some examples of which I'll admit in advance I'm a bit biased to, would be the Dominican flag hanging up in the gym, which is the same gym Matt's father used to box at. And now I believe Matt owns it or owns the space, even though it doesn't operate as a gym anymore. There was also a scene with Bustelo coffee, which is my go-to coffee of choice. It's what we have here at home. And the Greca, which is the first time I've seen a Greca. It's like a stovetop percolator. That's also what I use to make coffee. So that was dope to see in the series. There's some powerful social commentary about the legal system and just crime and poverty, some of which I'll circle back to. But it's just that level of grounding detail that helps keep a genre story like this one from floating away into just being fantasy and fantastical superhero stuff. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight the great John Wick level brutal violence within the series. It's really action packed, and I thought they did a great job with it. For example, it's some of which is very unexpected. It kind of takes you off guard, but like Wilson Fisk snapping at someone that fucked something up and that were in his car or in the SUV, and he grabs the person, just starts hitting him, and then puts his head, opens the car door, puts his head there, and just slams the car door on the person's head until there's literally no more head. Then you have this other amazing fucking scene where someone at a lower level on the totem pole within Fisk's crime syndicate organization, Daredevil gets to him and beats him up into divulging that he works for Fisk. But instead of facing the consequences of if and when Fisk finds out that he gave up his name, and he knows that Fisk would then get retribution on him and his family, the guy just gets up after getting fucked up by Daredevil, who's a very talented martial artist, by the way, and tells him something to the effect of what Fisk would do to him is way worse than anything else. And the guy just takes himself and like headbutts this metal rod spike sticking out of like a concrete wall, just headbutts himself into it through his eye and kills himself standing up. It was sick. I rewatched that scene a couple times. I was just like, it was so unexpected. I was like, what? You have another scene later on in the series where Fisk takes the police commissioner, which he has since blackmailed, but he's having like a change of heart and not wanting to follow suit. with Fisk and his dealings and helping them out. And Fisk just literally takes his head and squeezes it, because they depict him as having like this, not superhuman strength, but just extremely strong, big dude. And he just grabs him by the skull and just squeezes and squeezes and squeezes until he like breaks his whole fucking face. His skull just caves it in on both sides and rips his jaw off of his face at the same time. It was just like, holy fuck. Like, you do not see some of these things coming. And these aren't just shock moments. They are shock moments, but they aren't just that. They're like narrative turning points. Whenever these peaks of violence occur, there are changes in relationships. There are shifts in alliances. And the situations force different characters that witness them or that are affected by them. It forces them into like new moral territory. So a few high level takeaways for myself and fellow writers out there that I got from the Daredevil series would be, first, to mirror your hero and villain so that they reflect each other's wounds. Second, and if I had to rank these, I'd probably rank this one as like most important in this type of storytelling, is to embrace the gray morality. It's way more compelling to have gray, morally ambiguous characters than having just black and white, good versus evil type characters. And third, sprinkle backstory throughout like present action so that the payoff of the knowledge of those backstories feels earned versus just like dumped via exposition. And actually one more, which is, don't underestimate the power of like really small authentic details, even if most folks don't catch it. Just like I'm sure a bunch of those that stood out to me, like the Dominican flag and Bustelo coffee and the Greca and stuff like that, are things that like resonated with me, but I'm sure there were a bunch of other, whether it be cultural or otherwise, elements that just didn't necessarily resonate with me, but that did with other folks that watched the show. And they probably had that same effect on them as those things had on me. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper. Related to character origins and emotional hooks, the initial trauma that we see Matt's character go through is the blinding accident and the act of heroism that he committed by saving the old man that was about to get hurt from these barrels of like toxic chemicals that were falling off of a truck, I believe it was. But that act of heroism planted the seed which had the lasting consequences of his vigilante heroism in the future. There was also a scene early on in the series where he's in a church confessional booth, this church that he frequents, and later it's revealed that it's actually the foster home of the church that he grew up in once his dad was killed. So he has this bond with the priest of the church, the father of the church, but he gives this jaded monologue while in the confessional booth all around faith and guilt and justice and good versus evil, and asking for forgiveness for things that he's going to do. And it kind of sets the moral tone for the series. And then we have his father's sacrifice, where his father chose honor over survival. He knew very well that he was going to get killed for doing what he did. He had an arrangement with the mob where he would throw fights and the mob would bet against him for specific rounds where he would throw fights. You know, he would obviously get his ass kicked, but make money, and it was like steady income. But he kind of had this chip on his shoulder about it because he wanted and could win a lot of those fights. And Matt, at the time, his son, was a little boy. He didn't know about these arrangements with the mob. He just thought his dad, won some and lost some. But his father chose honor over survival, in that he wanted his son to see him win versus the outcome of what he knew was going to happen, because the mob was going to lose a shitload of money if he did that. And that honor versus survival dynamic we see mirrored in Matt's later struggles throughout the entire series. And a great writing insight to take away is that starting with formative trauma creates immediate emotional investment. And then adding to that, having your villain parallel and mirror your protagonist is also a great tool. Where we have Fisk, for example, who has an abusive father, not a loving father. But with what happened with Fisk killing his own father as a kid, he winds up in this very similar orphan-like situation as Matt does. And it humanizes him in a way. Like once that's revealed, you're like, oh fuck, this kid is all screwed up from when he was little. And then it kind of like gives much more understanding to how it is that he became who he became. And it serves as a way to deepen that hero-villain connection. Now diving into gray morality and complicated alliances, which I thought the introduction of the Punisher's character did so very impressively and very poignantly. He and Daredevil have this moral red line in the sand, where Daredevil has a no-kill stance against bad guys, and Punisher has a kill them twice if you can stance. And now circling back to that cemetery monologue that I mentioned earlier, where we get more insight into his character and why he has this bloodlust. He tells Red, as he calls Daredevil, this story about returning home from war. He was a Marine, and surprising his daughter at school, and then spending days with her, reading to her, and then ultimately having to hold her lifeless body in his arms because she and his son and his wife all got murdered in front of him. And when you have a backstory like that in a character, you're like, fuck. I may not agree with the approach, but I get it. Then you have another complicated alliance in a character by the name of Elektra Nachios, played by Elodie Young. Now, Elektra's character I remember from the comic books, and in this series, she plays like the old flame of Matt's. Definitely one that has his number emotionally, and she grew up very similar, orphaned, mentored by the same person, Stick, which I'll speak about in a bit, but she doesn't have the same moral compass that Matt does. She's a paid assassin, she's involved in corporate espionage, she's all about riches and has like no qualms about it. And a writing insight that these characters definitely highlight is that moral gray areas force the audience to question their own values. And we as writers can deepen the stakes of a story by pairing characters with similar goals but opposite methods. Like, for example, a Daredevil and a Punisher, or a Punisher and a Wilson Fisk, or a Daredevil and an Elektra, so on and so forth. And circling back to the alliance between Punisher and Fisk, which I mentioned earlier, the temporary alliance, just to expand on it a bit, is that there were these two enemies that were working together for a temporary amount of time because their goals overlap, knowing that they were going to clash again in the future. And the situation was essentially that Fisk gave the Punisher an opportunity for him to avenge his family's death. So the little origin of this bloodlust that he now has to go like scorched earth on all bad guys, especially having to do with the death of his family. Fisk facilitates him being able to do so. And the benefit for Fisk is that a lot of the people that he points the Punisher towards are his competition within the criminal underbelly. And both of them essentially agree to this alliance, but with the understanding that once this temporary period is over, it's back to on site. Now, speak a bit about layering backstories and the depth of certain characters. The way they did this with the dynamic between Fisk and FBI agent Dex is that they used flashback scenes sprinkled throughout the present day, so you knew where things were going to end up as the story progressed, but it also ratcheted up the suspense because you're learning about certain elements from his past while following specific actions in his present. And that was just a great creative way to show Fisk's ability to manipulate even someone as high up as like an FBI agent, and kind of bring them into his fold, while also showing us what Agent Dex was capable of. Then probably one of the craziest backstories in the series was Karen Page's tragic past, which for us as the audience complicates her like idealistic bend that we come to know in the series, while also making us understand how it fuels her risk aversion, or not risk aversion, but it fuels her risky choices that she makes throughout the series. And her backstory is essentially her mother dies of cancer, her father, brother, and herself are left with the carrying on the family business, which is this fledgling hole-in-the-wall diner that she's the unofficial glue for, keeping everything together. She also has this druggy boyfriend and likes to party, and she does drugs and sells drugs with the boyfriend. It's kind of her way to unwind, like just the stress and tension of keeping everything up on the family front, but also wanting more. And she's really smart, but puts off going to college because of the death of the mother and this feeling of being like anchored to home to help the father and brother. And they kind of sort of push her into going to college, to going away, but more so because the father also wants to get her away from this like druggy boyfriend. And it all comes to a head when she gets home like drunk and high with the boyfriend, who's also drunk and high, and the brother confronts the boyfriend and tells him to like stay away from her. They get into a fight, but the boyfriend is, it's not just like a shoving match type of fight or a couple punches thrown. Like the boyfriend is like fucking him up and about to hurt him, like grabs a bat or like something. And Karen grabs the boyfriend's gun from the car and shoots her boyfriend, who's about to like really fuck up her brother. Shoots him like in the shoulder or the arm. And then they hop in the car, Karen and her brother, to get away from the guy. And they're like speeding away. And remember, she's like drunk and high. She winds up getting into a car accident that kills her brother. Tell me that's not fucked up and dark. And then the cherry on top is that after that happens, I think the boyfriend did wind up dying, if I'm not mistaken, or at the very least like getting arrested. But it's a small town. The sheriff was cool with the dad. They kind of like cover up what happened and that it was technically Karen's fault, the death of her brother. They rule it all an accident, and the cherry on top is that the father disowns her and tells her, go away, do what you want with your life, but get the fuck out of here, basically. And that's all backstory that once revealed, once we peel back those layers, we have such a different understanding of Karen's character and the choices that she's made thus far and that she continues to make throughout the series. Then you have Ray Nadim's character, another FBI agent played by Jay Ali. He's like this good man trapped in a corrupt system. Fisk and Dex compromise him, and he has a wife and a small kid, and because of that, fear of what could happen to them goes along, but then regrets it and winds up going to the chief of the FBI in this like private meeting at her house with like the legal rep from the FBI. He like calls this meeting to tell her everything, that he and Dex are compromised because of Wilson Fisk, so on and so forth. And then his boss, the agent, shoots in her kitchen. By the way, they're sitting in her kitchen and her kid just went off to school. She shoots that legal rep in the head, and it's revealed that even she's working for Fisk, even she's compromised. So Ray Nadim's character is like caught between a rock and a hard place, where he's like, fuck, I came clean and now my boss is even fucking corrupted by all this shit. And just a great writing insight to take away from those backstories is that layering in backstories and using flashback scenes into the present narrative instead of just like dumping it all at once, it keeps the tension high throughout your story and definitely rewards attentive readers and viewers, however it is that you're telling your story. And I wanted to shout out a few other notable characters and a few lines of dialogue from some of them. Starting with Ben Urich, played by Bondi Curtis Hall. He's like the OG Walter Cronkite like investigative reporter that takes Page's character under his wing, and that's where she gets like the reporting bug and ultimately winds up becoming a reporter from there on out. But he tells her this line that I really liked, which was, quote, that in his experience there are no heroes, no villains, just people with different agendas. Then you have this character called Stick. He is the mentor for Matt when Matt was a child. Stick, played by Scott Glenn. He's also, it's revealed later on in the series, the mentor for Elektra as well. And everything about him is not yet fully told, as I remember it. It's like the series is definitely going to come to a head with him involved in some way, shape, or form. But he essentially like brought Matt up, taught him all the martial arts that he knows, nurtured him into heightening his other senses because he is also blind. And he tells him this dope line during training, which is that anger is a spark and rage is a wildfire, and both are useless if you can't control it. There was a cool character that I liked called James Wesley, played by Toby Leonard Moore. He's the right-hand man to Kingpin. He's his assistant, he's his best friend, he's the ultimate facilitator. He would do everything from recommending wines so that Fisk could look good on a date, requesting that wine, to handling all his dirty work and meetings and everything under the sun. And I liked how they used the dynamic of his best friend and partner, Foggy, that I mentioned earlier. And they used that relationship, the dynamic between that relationship, as an exposition tool to explain more of how Matt went from being that little blind kid, the scared blind kid, to Daredevil. Because of the fact that Foggy was like so pissed off that he never told him, and that he's doing it in the first place. He's, worried about his friend getting hurt and just full of shitload of questions. So as he asks those questions, we get answers to Matt's past sprinkled throughout. And there's this great line that Matt says to his new legal partner. This is later on in season 4, to Kirsten, when he's like really frustrated about how things are going, the legal system, the fact that Poindexter went to jail and then he got out of jail. He delivers this great line that I liked, where he says, quote, "We're not contributing to justice here. We're just babysitting chaos." I thought that was great. Now, a bit about subtle world building and realism. We touched on earlier, like those cultural details, certain things that I picked up on, like a Dominican flag at the gym, the Bustelo coffee, the Greca, things like that help in grounding the world in authentic touches, or with authentic touches rather. Matt also goes out on a date with a girl, and he shouts out Sal and Chris and Charlie's while he's on this blind date with her, which, if you don't know, is probably the greatest sandwich spot. Definitely in Queens, I would probably say in New York, at least that I've had to date. And I've gone there multiple times. If you haven't gone, he's a reco for you. Look up Sal and Chris spelled with a K, so K-R-I-S. It's called Sal, Chris, and Charlie's. It looks like a regular like bodega, but they're known for their sandwiches. Go, you're gonna be online for a while, but it's worth the wait, and it's not too crazy of a line. But you will be on a line. But the turnover is like really quick. Grab some chips, grab yourself a beverage. You'll see the menu there of the different types of sandwiches that they have. And then take your sandwiches to Astoria Park, which is a nice park right under the Triborough Bridge, I believe it is, and a nice view of the water. I've done it with wifey. I've done it with wifey and the kids multiple times. And just chill there, eat your sandwich, taking the views. It's nice now in the summertime, even in the fall, the spring. Highly, highly recommend. But anyway, Matt shouts out Sal and Chris, which was definitely dope to hear. So that was a nice grounding detail that, made this world feel more realistic. And there was this great scene where Matt is kind of going through the motions and helping this. He has this like pro bono case like drop on his lap, and he's like preoccupied mentally thinking about vigilante shit. And there was this shoplifter guy who he's trying to convince to plead out and just take the 5 days in jail, slap on the wrist type of thing, which he negotiated down from like a year or two that they wanted to give this guy because he was like a repeat offender. And the guy's pushing back and saying, I'm not doing 5 days. Yeah, I stole the fucking food, because he stole some food from a supermarket. And Matt is kind of taken aback because he's like, this like high-powered attorney at this point, and he like takes this case, negotiates this sweetheart deal for this guy that should be like over the moon thanking him. And the guy's pushing back and telling him to do more, to do his job better. And he's kind of like, what the fuck? But the guy, Leroy, played by Charlie Hudson III, delivers this like little monologue to Matt telling him that his SSI and food stamps were cut off. And like when he went to find out why, he couldn't get a straight answer, and then his meeting was rescheduled, and really gave this like his case fell through the cracks and now he's fucked without food type of story. And he says this line which really resonated with me, which is that they're willing to spend 5 times more to lock me up than to feed me, and I'm supposed to be fucking thankful. And just hearing that like shifted Matt's perspective like in the moment, and kind of like snapped him out of that preoccupation that he was in, and was a salient point. It was a interesting social commentary on that particular aspect of the system and poverty. And a definite writing insight to take away from that is that small authentic details like that give these genre stories a little bit of real world texture, and they definitely go a long way. One more point that I wanted to say about like all the like the high stakes and the brutality and the violence throughout the series, like I mentioned earlier, is that from a writing perspective, these like darker genres, the type of violence that we see works best, in my opinion, when it changes the trajectory of the story or of a character, or shifts their understanding about something. It's not just like violence for violence sakes. It forces the characters into like new moral territory. I think that's the main like writing insight to take away from those type of visceral violent moments, aside from just like the adrenaline jolt as an audience member of watching these action-packed scenes. A few more high-level themes and takeaways for my fellow writers out there are the duality of a hero and a villain. So how Matt and Fisk are mirror images of each other, both shaped by trauma, but defined by the choices that they make and how they decide to move forward in the world. Conflict layering is another good one, where there's multiple facets throughout the story that are at odds with each other. You have the legal system and the law versus vigilantes and vigilante justice. You have different gangs versus corrupt institutions, corrupt cops. You have personal loyalty within characters versus moral duty within characters. Another good one is the moral evolution of our characters, like the Punisher and his bloodthirsty approach to getting some semblance of justice. Tra's moral slipperiness, Karen's character, and how all of those characters force Matt's character, the Daredevil's character, to reevaluate his own code in different ways. And pacing big reveals. We learn about the Punisher's tragic past, like I broke down earlier. We learn about Karen's backstory. We even find out in the series what happened to Matt's mother. Shout out to Sister Maggie, played by Joan Wally, which was definitely a holy shit moment in the series. And all those big reveals are strategically placed throughout the series for a maximum emotional payoff for us, the viewers. And that's definitely something for us as writers to take away and to try to do within our own stories. And watching this series, for me, definitely shows that superhero storytelling can be elevated through like moral complexity and cultural specificity, layered human drama and trauma. And I just wanted to ask my dear listeners out there, Which Daredevil storyline hit you the hardest? Was it Matt's moral struggles? Was it Wilson Fisk's rise? Was it the Punisher's grief? Or something else altogether? Hit me up and let me know. And the final takeaway from my fellow writers out there is that the best action stories aren't just about who wins the fight. They're about what's at stake internally when the fighting stops. Check out Daredevil seasons 1 through 3, as well as season 4 Daredevil Born Again, streaming now on Disney+.